Hi, I'm Dr. Henry Emmons.
I am Dr. Tim Colbert.
And I'm Amy.
So tonight we're talking about difficult emotions, not the really, really bad ones that kind of knock us off our feet, but just the everyday things like the stress that comes from technology not working. So that kind of thing. I'm going to start by reading one of my favorite Rumi poems. It's a poem about emotion, at least that's how I read it, and it's called The Guest House. This being human is a guest house. Every morning, a new arrival, a joy, a depression, a meanness. Some momentary awareness comes as an unexpected visitor. Welcome and entertain them all. Even if they're a crowd of sorrows who violently sweep your house empty of its furniture, still treat each guest honorably. He may be clearing you out for some new delight. The dark thought, the shame, the malice, meet them at the door laughing and invite them in. Be grateful for whoever comes because each has been sent as a guide from beyond. So I want to begin my comments by talking with you a little bit about some of the research that came out of the University of Wisconsin about the prefrontal cortex. So bear with me here. This is the work of Richie Davidson, who many people in the mindfulness community know about. And so the prefrontal cortex is this area of the brain really directly behind the forehead. So it's divided into two sides, the left and the right prefrontal cortex. And it is part of what Dr. Davidson calls the circuitry of emotion. And so it involves the amygdala, which is a little deeper in the brain. But remember, the brain works really by communication, by the movement of energy through these neurons, these pathways, if you will. And so this is part of that pathway that has to do with emotion, particularly the emotion around fear, but other things too. And so Dr. Davidson's research suggests that this has a lot to do with what is called our affective style, meaning the way that we typically kind of engage the world, if you will. So in general terms, the left prefrontal cortex has to do with what we might call positive emotions. And it's our ability to approach things with a sense of security, confidence, and being able to move ourselves towards some desired goal. When the right prefrontal cortex is the more active one, it's sort of the opposite. It fills us with negative emotions. There's a sense of needing to withdraw, to protect ourselves when we feel threatened, for example. And sometimes it's accompanied by feelings of fear or even disgust. So this is, I think, in very simple terms, it's the difference between us feeling open and expansive or feeling closed and shut down. I want to tell you another personal story to kind of illustrate this. At least to me, this really was a clear example of how this system might work. This took place for me quite a while ago when I was in a job that I was just not happy with. And I was so stressed. I don't think I even quite realized how stressed I was, but it was affecting my health. I had a touch of asthma symptoms, which I had never had before, just developed them as an adult. And so I had this tightness, literally a tightness or a constriction feeling in my chest. And I was meditating one day and really trying to think about, gosh, what do I do about this job? Do I stay in it? Do I leave it? I was the sole breadwinner in our family at the time. We had young kids. I just was racked with indecision about what to do. And so as I was meditating, I was kind of imagining myself resigning from the job, and noticed as I did that my chest had this feeling of openness and expansion, and my airways felt looser, lighter, more open. And then I started thinking about, staying in the job, and I had this constriction again. My airways felt like they closed. My chest was tight. I just had this sense of closeness and constriction. And so I thought, this is really interesting. I am going to use this to kind of ask my inner self, if you will, for some guidance here. What do I do about this big decision? So I literally posed the question to myself and gave myself this message. Okay, if the answer is yes, then I want to feel this openness. If the answer is no, I want to feel closed. And so I asked myself, should I leave this job? Open things up. My airways open, my chest opens, I feel a sense of lightness. And then I asked the opposite, should I stay in this job? And bam, everything closed down again. So this was really clear. This was not subtle, but still I was so indecisive. I had to go through this about 3 times before I really felt comfortable with it. And then I got up, wrote my resignation letter that I turned in the next day. So one way to think about emotions, even the negative ones, what we think of as negative, we give them that label, is that there is this continuum between openness and closedness. And one of the advantages of this is that it can serve as a navigational tool, if you will. It's almost like having a navigational device in a car, that a GPS kind of a program that tells you when you have gotten off track, off course, and what turn you need to make to get back on it. And I believe it literally can work that way. Like Rumi said in his poem, sometimes they're a message sent from beyond to give us guidance. There is another way of thinking about emotions, the continuum of emotions. And this gets into what the Buddhist psychology would consider to be the origin of suffering. So last week, if you listened or checked out the talk, we talked about the second arrow, about how we cause harm to ourselves in response to something happening in our life, something we perceive as bad or threatening or stressful. And one of the ways that we do that, one of the ways we can cause harm, is by our emotional reaction, especially by the degree or the extent of that reaction, the intensity of it, and then what we do in response to it. So in the Buddhist psychology, they talk about the cause of suffering, the real cause of emotional suffering is attachment. It is wanting things to be a certain way, the way that we want them to be. And then when they're not that way, like technology not working or the coronavirus coming and just uprooting our lives, that we react with a negative emotion because we're resisting it. We are attached to things being a certain way, and it's our resistance rather than surrendering and going with the flow of life. It's that resistance that makes us unhappy. And in that psychology, I call it the psychology of mindfulness, there are these 3 typical common patterns, 3 different ways that we have of reacting in kind of an unpleasant or unhelpful way because of our resistance to what is. The first of these, which a lot of you are going to relate to, I relate to this one more than the others. The first is called grasping, holding on too tightly. The thing that drives this tends to be our sense of insecurity, the fear that we're not enough or that we're not going to have enough. A good recent example of that is people hoarding toilet paper because they're fear that they're not going to have enough of it. It's that sense of grasping, and it creates fear and anxiety and a sense of personal insufficiency, that I'm not enough. And the antidote to that, a really great antidote to that, is to practice generosity. The second common pattern is called rejecting. It's pushing things away. So in this instance, when we see something we don't want, we judge it. We become critical. We become angry or resentful about it. It is not wanting what is and trying to then push it away. The antidote to that is to practice acceptance. And then the third common pattern is known as denial. Actually, in the Buddhist literature, they call it delusion, but in our terminology, that means something else. So it's really denial. It's the unwillingness to see things as they are. And it's driven by the wish that things would just go away. It's putting your head in the sand. It's not wanting even to look at what's happening. The emotion that often comes with that is something like flatness or apathy. And the antidote to that pattern is awareness. Heighten your awareness, your ability and your willingness to see what is. So it's grasping, it's pushing away, or it is denial. And of course, we all do all of those things, but we may have a tendency to do one of them more than others. That it's our favorite flavor or our typical reaction to something. And it's worth knowing that, because it gives us a way in to try to counter it with one of those antidotes, for example. So at this time of coronavirus, the reaction that we have might coincide with one of those patterns. So if the reaction is, if we're grasping, the reaction might be fear. If we are rejecting, the reaction might be to feel frustrated and want this to go away and want us to get back to work and get our lives back to what they used to be. And if it is denial, we might just feel bored, tired, apathetic. So another continuum, another way to think about the continuum of emotion is going from feeling disconnected from our emotions to feeling completely flooded by them. So even if we have one of these emotions I just described, these what we consider to be unpleasant or negative emotions, if we feel them really strongly and really intensely, we're being flooded by them. If we ignore them, we deny them, we won't let ourselves even feel or see them, then we're disconnected from our emotions. And neither of those is going to work. We don't want to let too much in, but we also don't want to push it all away. So we want to find that middle ground. We want to be not too much, not too little. So we want to be aware of our feelings, in touch with them, and we want to actually let ourselves have them. Like Rumi's poem, we want to invite them in. So I want to invite us as a group to do a practice, a short practice about how we might deal with these difficult emotions. I'm going to talk us through it first, and then we'll guide a brief meditation in doing that. How we deal with these negative or unpleasant emotions is, in a word, it is acceptance. It is to stop resisting what is. It's really an extension of what we talked about last week about being aware of our thoughts. In this case, we want to be able to experience our emotions. We don't want to just let them happen unconsciously. We want to actually give them our attention, like a guest in the poem. So we want to be able to have what's known as a visceral experience, that we actually feel it in our body, because that's where these emotions live. They live in our body, generally somewhere between the throat and the groin. So it's in the viscera, if you will, typically the heart or the gut. And so we want to direct our attention there really purposely, intentionally, so that we can actually give these emotions their due, give them the awareness, the attention that they're asking for. We're also trying to take advantage or to align ourselves with what's known as the law of impermanence, which means that nothing lasts. Everything changes all the time, including our emotions. Now, if any of you have dealt with something like depression or really bad anxiety, when you are in the thick of that negative emotion, it often feels like it is never going to go away. Sometimes you even begin to think that it's always been there, that this is just how I feel, that it's just my natural state. It's never true, but it often feels that way. And so we're trying to align ourselves with the recognition that, in fact, no emotion stays the same. It is constantly moving and changing within our body. Rilke put it beautifully in one of his poems. He said, "Let everything happen to you, beauty and terror. Just keep going. No feeling is final." So let me just take you through briefly an experience of feeling some negative emotion. I'm going to suggest that you not work with the biggest one that you have, or a traumatic memory or emotion, but just something that maybe you're experiencing recently, or you're experiencing during this self-quarantine. Again, it could be just how are you reacting to the whole coronavirus upheaval, or how it's affected your work life or your relationships, any of those things. I'm sure you have feelings about that. We all do. So pick something that feels real to you, that feels current or recent, and we'll work with it by giving it some of our attention. So I'll invite you for just a few minutes to settle yourself, sit upright comfortably, not rigid, but not slouching or letting yourself go too much from side to side, just sitting in a dignified sort of position. Allow your eyes to close if you'd like. And then notice your breathing for a moment. Notice how you're sitting and how you're held from below. How you are supported in this very moment and in so many ways in your life. And then let your attention turn for a moment to remembering something that has caused you some emotional turbulence, some kind of a mild disruption, an unpleasant feeling. If it helps you, you can think very specifically about the cause of this. Maybe it's a person or an event or a loss. And then direct your attention to your body, somewhere in this midsection, the chest or the gut, and just see if you can find the place where this feeling resides. Where is it if you feel afraid? Where is it if you feel frustrated or impatient? Where is it if you feel shut down? Is it just a general, broad position in your body? Doesn't need to be any certain way, just experience what is. And see if you can allow your attention to be completely on this feeling, this sensation, the physical sensation of it. See if you can put some words to describing it, just silently to yourself. Does it feel painful? Does it feel sharp or dull? Is it moving from one part of your body to another? Or does it grow and then recede? If you think about it, does the energy of it or the sensation get stronger? If your awareness lapses, does it weaken? Does it dissipate? Keep your attention as long as you can on this physical feeling of the emotion. You don't need to change it. You don't need to figure it out. You don't need to understand where it came from. You just need to give it your attention. Keep breathing and keep paying attention to the feeling inside. And notice what has happened just with this little bit of observing of your own experience. Notice if anything is different now than when you started or during the middle. And again, it doesn't need to be any certain way. You only need to see and allow what is. And then bring your awareness back to your breath. Allow your eyes to open. And bring yourself back to your room or back to observing the screen that you're using. And so, whether or not you were able to connect with a feeling right now, it is a meditative technique that you can use to work with those everyday kinds of emotions that are kind of nagging, not so terrible, but still maybe affecting your day or your quality of your relationships. You can give it your attention, see what happens. You will almost always find that it changes. And if you can experience that emotion fully, if you can really let yourself have the feelings of sadness or loss or fear or frustration, they will leave. Like a good guest, they won't stick around forever. So thank you. I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Colbert for a few minutes.
Well, thank you, Henry. That was really interesting and made me think about, with that discussion about, feeling constricted, you mentioned at one point in your life versus feeling more open. I think about kids when I talk about emotions with the children and the teens that I see. And sometimes another way that they kind of resonate to this concept is to discuss what we think of as negative emotions, maybe things like fear or sadness or anger, as depleting. So I sometimes talk along those lines. And emotions that are more positive, kind of traditionally, joy, appreciation, excitement, we can think of as renewing emotions. So again, I think it's fun to try to think of ways to talk about this with adults and kids and teens in ways that they can really connect to it. We know that kids are experiencing a lot of depleting emotions these days. I think a lot of the kids and teens that I see are moving from anxiety and fear to more of an irritability, even a sadness and kind of apathy. And that's a tough thing for them. We do know that even exclusive of the coronavirus situation, that anxiety in general in our culture in the pediatric population has increased by about 20% over the last several years. And one of the things we think about is, why is that? And I think it's a lot of different factors. Certainly one of the big things is high expectations in our culture and pressure to succeed academically, socially, and even in your hobbies. Like, you want to be really good at sports. There's a lot of competitiveness out there for a variety of reasons. I think also, not just with coronavirus, but in general, the world feels scarier to people and threatening. Besides natural disasters and infections and pandemics, we have mass shootings, we have wars, we have terrorism. So there's a lot going on. And then amplifying the fear or anxiety even further, I think, is this access 24 hours a day, 7 days a week to electronic and social media, of course. So I think we want to really help kids to deal with this. But first, in order to help them to cope with it, we have to recognize that they are struggling. And my main point tonight is that kids oftentimes, and teenagers, manifest anxiety and depression symptoms differently than adults. And so I think it's useful to think about it in three main categories. The symptoms, instead of just looking classically like, or you could ask them, are you feeling anxious? And kids might not necessarily know what that means. An adult might say, well, I have this fear or I have this concern. But kids oftentimes, number one, will show social and emotional changes. The most common thing that I see is they become much more emotionally reactive. They get irritated easily, and they come to anger more quickly. So that's one of the patterns I think that you're more likely to see in a child with anxiety than just them looking fearful or worried. Secondly, oftentimes the opposite thing in some ways will happen as well. In some kids, will look like they're more flat. They're apathetic and kind of anhedonic. Nothing seems to bring out enjoyment. And so be aware of that. The other thing we see commonly in this category of social emotional changes is withdrawal and isolation. They just tend to pull back from family and friends and not really be available to engage with anyone. And then also they will commonly begin avoiding participating in some of their favorite activities. Like, they typically might enjoy a given hobby or a sport or a game, and they'll start not doing that as well. They might just isolate themselves in their room, for example. Now, in terms of physical changes, that's another category to look for. One of the more common things is vague aches and pains. The most common thing that I see is unexplained stomach aches, not associated with bowel movement changes, but also headaches, and a lot of vague complaints of uneasiness or distress. You also will see things like low energy pretty commonly. And also in the physical category, I would definitely look for changes in sleep patterns, of course. Too much sleep, too little sleep, or excessive daytime sleepiness, despite the fact that your child or teen might have slept a good 8 or 9 hours that night. And then finally, I would watch for school performance changes. So things like not getting their homework done, typically a good student, suddenly missing assignments, just not caring, lack of motivation, seeming to just have a lot of trouble concentrating when that was not a problem before. So these are the things to watch for. Now, the question is always, I think, how do you know when you get to a point where you cannot manage this as a parent anymore? And maybe, or perhaps you need to refer your child for mental health support. I think that really comes down to functional impairment. How much difficulty are they having? So I think the first thing to think about is, are they having difficulties significantly in more than one domain of their life? Socially, academically, with family members. If they're really struggling across the board, think about a referral to a psychologist or a psychiatrist, or even at least talking to your primary care doctor. If they start feeling bad about themselves, becoming very self-critical or lacking in confidence, that's a real marker as well that things are not going in a good way. I think if they're also feeling hopeless a lot of the time, and certainly engaged in any kind of self-harm or thinking that they want to harm others, of course, that's an indication for considering a referral as well to a mental health professional. And I think also if you see just more negative behaviors in general, I kind of think of that as irritability, negativity, refusal behaviors for sure. A lot of oppositional behaviors, and especially in a child that had previously been cooperative, that's a biggie as well. And then finally, things like new habits that develop, nail biting, picking at their skin, any kind of self-destructive behavior is something to be very wary of. And so just a few things to think about. And so what do you do in this situation where, given the fact that we're, quarantined, it's sometimes hard just to get out and, make an appointment. So a couple things I would offer up to you as resources that are quite helpful. Number one, in the state of Minnesota, we have a set of crisis mental health telephone lines that are open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week by county. So we will post that resource on the website for you. And every county in the state of Minnesota basically has access to this kind of service. So at a minimum, you can always call one of these crisis lines for mental health services, and they'll help you to decide what to do. You can always also take your child to an emergency room anywhere in the Twin Cities or outstate. And then secondly, there's a national mental health line for kids through this group called SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. So we have a link for that as well. They have a great online resource, and they are also available by telephone 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. So I think the bottom line for me is that make sure that you're watching for these signs and symptoms in your child that are different than they might present in adults in terms of social, emotional, physical, and academic changes in their behavior. And think about referring if you need to, and then if you do need to refer to a mental health professional, make sure you take advantage of these resources. All right, so I think we probably have a few minutes for questions left. Henry, you want to start us off?
Yes, I do. Yeah, so sorry we're running late. We got started late, so we're gonna go ahead and answer a few questions. And if you have to go, of course you have to go. But thanks for hanging in there with us. So here's a question that was asked about sleep, something we talked about a couple weeks ago. And it's partly for Dr. Culbert, partly for me, but one of the questions is, what about sleep medication combined with magnesium? We talked about how helpful magnesium is. One of the great things about using the Relax powder, magnesium threonate, is that it doesn't really interact with anything. It's very safe. You can easily combine it with other medications. It's not going to knock you out, but it might just help deepen your sleep or relax you so you're able to stay asleep a little bit longer or more easily. About the only side effect that we ever see from that is that because it also works on the gut muscles, it can sometimes cause some loose stools. So if you're getting too much magnesium, you will notice that you'll get loose stools. And then, of course, you just need to back off on the dose. It's not harmful, but it just can be a little bit unpleasant. And then to piggyback on that, Tim, what about waking up in the middle of the night, for a toddler or child? And what are some quick solutions, ways to help people get back to sleep?
Sure. I think the main thing for younger kids is to make certain that you as parents, from a behavioral standpoint, leave their room prior to the time they're actually asleep. So you want your child to be drowsy when you leave the room, but if you wait till you are asleep, or they are asleep, and then you leave the room, what happens in the night then, when they wake up, they need to recreate that same circumstance. They'll want you to be there. So that's one thing to know about behaviorally. Now, in terms of options for supplements that are gentle, people don't realize this as much, but if nighttime awakenings are the main issue and your child is otherwise falling asleep quite well, you can use what's called controlled release or sustained release melatonin. Usually the dose for kids is about 3 milligrams, and also for adults, actually, you can go as high as about 5 or 6 milligrams, but that helps kids and teens to sustain sleep across the night. Another good option that's all natural is called inositol, I-N-O-S-I-T-O-L. That's a white powder that tastes kind of sweet, and that can help people to stay asleep as well. You can mix the powder in juice or water. The typical dose is 2,000 to 3,000 milligrams given about an hour before bedtime. And then one last comment. Some people wake up in the middle of the night because they are hypoglycemic, relatively speaking. So remember, for those kids that are waking up frequently, try a high protein snack right before bedtime, and that will sustain their blood sugar a longer period of time across the night and make it less likely that they will awaken.
So here's a question I think is really good that that is really worth thinking about and talking about. It's dealing with fear and anger. Which do we address first? I think that if you look a little bit deeper, if you go below the anger and try to see what it is that's triggering the anger, it is almost always based on fear. So I think that, fear, the feeling threatened, feeling insecure in some way is often the trigger of all of the negative emotions: shame, guilt, feeling shut down, you name it. It's almost always related at its root cause to fear. And also, we talked a little bit about this last week, but it is very often, I would say probably 90% of the time, it is ongoing stress and the fear response or stress response that causes almost all the other imbalances. So however the mood or the anxiety problems show up, it's almost always driven by that. So sometimes we do have to deal first with anger if it's really strong or if it's become damaging to our relationships or to people around us. You still may have to deal directly with it. But I think if you go further, if you stick with it and go underneath, it's almost always somehow related to fear.
Along those same lines, when you think about fear, also what happens is physically the autonomic nervous system, called the sympathetic nervous system, gets very aroused. And so another nice thing to think about as an intervention is called biofeedback. And what that allows people to do is really measure and understand the level of nervous system arousal, which could then be triggering their anger, for example, and decrease that level of nervous system arousal with techniques such as paced diaphragmatic breathing or meditation or mental imagery. So, and I think that sense of control and empowerment, when you can learn to control the physical aspects of the fear response, is really very helpful for many people. So don't forget about biofeedback. When you get a chance, Google the terms temperature biofeedback and or heart rate biofeedback and take a look at that. But those are great techniques for this purpose.
So I think maybe we'll end with this next question, which in a sense is a prelude to our conversation next week. The question is, what about difficult emotions around feeling helpless? For example, parents in care facilities who are on lockdown and aren't tech savvy. It feels so hard to know someone is alone and likely struggling. This is a really, really difficult time to have loved ones in a care facility. We're worried about their health, of course, as we should be. We can see that. But I think one of the greatest heartaches right now, and really one of the big losses that the coronavirus has triggered in our time is that we can't connect with people who we know are alone and isolated and missing that kind of contact. And that's certainly true for a lot of our seniors. So, I don't have a good answer for this. I think, we can use the phone, and maybe if there's a staff person who can help them, set up a a Zoom meeting or a FaceTime or something like that, we should do that. But I also think that the truth is this is one of those very ambiguous losses that we're all experiencing right now that is really hard to deal with because we've never confronted anything quite like this before. And so next week, we're going to be joined by a friend and colleague, Catherine Duncan, who is a chaplain. She's worked in hospice care for years. And we're going to have I think, a rich conversation with her about loss as we usually experience it, but also about this, very weird way that we experience loss in the age of coronavirus. Thanks again, everybody.